Greetings, comrades. I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and this is not Russia, but it's snowy enough to stand in, isn't it? In 1917, the communist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin returned to the Russian capital of Petrograd. The Russian Tsar had just been forced to abdicate, but Russia remained embroiled in a grotesque world war, governed by an increasingly unpopular provisional government. To a rapt audience, Lenin proclaimed, "The people need land, the people need peace, the people need bread, and they give you war, hunger, and no bread. Leave the landlords still on the land. We must fight for the socialist revolution. Fight to the end until the complete victory of the proletariat. Long live the worldwide socialist revolution." By October of 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had seized power, inaugurating the first serious attempt at a communist government in all of world history. So what was the deal with this 1917 revolution in Russia? Did it deliver on its promises of true freedom and social justice? Or was it the totalitarian nightmare that its critics accused it of being? Or in other words, was the Russian Revolution of 1917 BS? Let's talk about it. Somewhere warmer. Now that I am in slightly warmer circumstances, let us continue with our discussion of the October 1917 revolution in Russia. Now, when you are dealing with any revolution, doesn't matter which one, and I have already done videos on both the French and Haitian revolutions, which you are encouraged to watch, that grapple with similar sorts of issues. But with any revolution, the Russian Revolution included, you have to consider a couple of questions. First of all, why did the revolution happen? And then also, was the revolution successful in achieving its goals? Given that communism has generated so many strong opinions, both for and against, unsurprisingly, the revolution in Russia has yielded a bunch of sharply divergent opinions and interpretations. The point of view of the Bolsheviks, the guys who would eventually become the governing communist party of the brand spanking new Soviet Union, was that their revolution had represented the will of the Russian people and that it had been a historical inevitability, that the sorts of social and economic forces that Karl Marx had described in all of his work was finally being demonstrated conclusively by events in Russia. On the other hand, critics of Soviet-style communism argued that this revolution was merely a crass power grab, that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had been shameless opportunists who had used the instability in the wake of World War I to seize power and institute a ruthless authoritarian dictatorship. Which side is right? You know, I hate to be one of those guys who says, well, you know, let's go for the Aristotelian golden mean. The truth is really somewhere in the middle. That's not always true. Obviously, there are plenty of instances in which one side's interpretation is right and the other is just full of crap. I think this is one of those instances where there is plenty of ammo to be found on both sides. I think it's pretty hard to argue that there wasn't a certain amount of opportunism involved in this revolution, and that it probably wouldn't have happened without something like World War I, which had made the Russian government so terribly unpopular. If you look at the governments of all of the other countries that were involved in World War I, a lot of them experienced social instability as well. The Russian Revolution merely represented the most dramatic example of that sort of thing. On the other hand, though, I don't think it is in any way conceivable that the Bolsheviks would have been as successful as they were without substantial popular support. You know, the provisional government in 1917 was tremendously unpopular. Russian involvement in World War I was something that the people of Russia hated, and there was increasing support as 1917 wore on for radical solutions. In fact, some scholars have noted that as eager as people like Lenin or some of his cronies in the Bolshevik faction, Trotsky or Bukharin, people like that, were for revolution, that it was the workers of Russia who pushed the Bolsheviks into the October Revolution rather than vice versa. And indeed, in the aftermath of the immediate seizure of power, the Russian Civil War that raged for the next several years, I think amply demonstrates that both sides have a case here. Critics of the Russian Revolution can be quick to note that there were all sorts of people who opposed the Bolshevik seizure of power and fought tooth and nail against it. Factions of monarchists, factions representing the Russian middle class. Particularly in the countryside, there was a fair amount of opposition. Also in the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks were fighting against substantial foreign intervention as well. Countries like Czechoslovakia, Japan, and France sent soldiers to try and strangle this communist uprising in the cradle. From the Anglophone world, worth noting that Great Britain sent about 40,000 troops and the United States some 10,000 troops. This is something that is not commonly taught in history classes in the United States, but I guarantee you it's something that even today every single Russian history student learns about in their history curriculum.
I do not think the American likes us. Good! I am not liking him. He is ugly.
So clearly the Bolsheviks did not have the support of all of the Russian people, but they had support in key sectors, particularly the military, the workers in the capital of Petrograd, in the largest city of Moscow, and all of the other cities. And that was enough to allow them to have a substantial foundation from which to establish a new revolutionary government. That answers the why for the Russian Revolution. Did it achieve its goals? Short answer is no. Obviously, the Soviet Union never became the classless society, the genuine people's democracy that its founders aspired to. Indeed, the whole shebang dissolved with sort of a whimper in 1991. So on that level, obviously, this revolution did not succeed. On the other hand, before we rake it over the coals, we should at least consider some of its achievements. I mean, first of all, 74 years is not an insubstantial stretch of time for a regime to exist. Clearly, it could have been longer, but it's not something that evaporates like the morning dew or something like that. This was a revolutionary regime that did have some staying power, and while it existed, there were certain concrete achievements. This is especially true if you consider what they started from. Coming out of the experience, first of all, of World War I, which killed nearly 2.5 million Russian citizens. And then on the heels of that, the gruesome Russian Civil War that saw another 10 million Russian citizens die. The economy, Russia's infrastructure in absolute rubble, shortages of food and all sorts of other necessities, epidemic disease raging through the countryside. Starting from that situation of almost utter devastation, it really is impressive how rapidly the Soviet economy rebounded. Even accounting for the fact that all Soviet economic data from, say, the 1920s and 1930s has to be taken with a certain grain of salt. The Soviet economy grew dramatically during the 20 years after the October Revolution. There were particularly impressive gains when it came to heavy industry, so stuff like steel production, expansion of the country's railroad network, military technology, like all of that stuff. The Soviet economy grew at a rapid clip. And whereas the Russian economy under the Tsars had restricted prosperity to a comparatively very narrow aristocratic strata, the Soviet government, after the revolution, did make genuine attempts to make the fruits of these economic gains widely available to all Soviet citizens. So this means that from the get-go, Soviet citizens were guaranteed access to healthcare, And that meant, among other things, that life expectancy in the Soviet Union rose steadily after the revolution. By the 1960s, life expectancy in the Soviet Union was roughly equivalent to what you saw in the capitalist West. Also worth noting that life expectancy after the collapse of the Soviet Union during the 1990s dropped pretty precipitously. So that is evidence that the overall health of the people of Russia improved under the Soviet Union. Likewise, for women, Russia before the revolution was intensely patriarchal. After the revolution, women had access to all of the same political rights as men, which is to say, in some ways, not that much, but still they were treated as equal citizens. Rights to divorce and abortion were guaranteed during the 1920s. Even if some of that stuff was subsequently undone by Stalin's regime, there were also substantial improvements in education, and literacy for the Soviet population improved from 28% before the revolution to, within the first 20 years of the Soviet Union's existence, 75%. So that's not too shabby. Ultimately, the improved educational system made itself felt in a number of different ways. The first stage of space exploration, the Soviet Union was clearly in the vanguard. They were the first ones to put an artificial satellite into orbit.
It's called Sputnik.
We know. Sit down.
And as I was saying, whoever controls the high ground of space will control the world. Now, the communists have established a foothold in outer space. Pretty soon they have damn space platforms up there to drop nuclear bombs on us, like rocks from a highway overpass. Now, how in the hell did they ever get ahead of us?
They sent the first man into space, the first woman into space. They did that 20 years before the United States sent its first female astronaut up. The first man in orbit, the first occupied space station. They sent the first, and thus far only, probe to the surface of the planet Venus. In terms of the country's military achievements, could note that the Soviet Union did a great deal of the heavy lifting when it came to defeating Nazi Germany in World War II.
Right, what's a war hero got to do? Get some lubrication around here.
And if you want to consider the Cold War, the mere fact that the Soviet Union could keep pace with the wealthiest and most powerful country on earth, the United States, and compete with it toe-to-toe.
There's the balcony opening round, and Rocky Balboa comes out to the center ring. Got the Russian right back into Balboa's corner now.
All over the planet for the better part of 50 years is an indication of the potency of the Soviet system.
Impressive. Most impressive.
All that said, though, we also do have to weigh the grotesque human cost of the October Revolution of 1917. And let's be clear, almost from the very beginning, the Soviet Union was an oppressive, one-party dictatorship which ruthlessly circumscribed political expression, crushed dissent, and imprisoned or even murdered millions of Soviet citizens. And sometimes you sort of see the tendency to try and blame Joseph Stalin for most of that. Some people sort of spin it almost like, the Beatles, that Lenin was John and Trotsky was Paul and like Stalin was Yoko and just came in and sort of ruined it all. And that's a distortion, ultimately. Certainly it is true that Stalin's government was an order of magnitude worse than what had preceded it in the Soviet Union during the 1920s. Even under the earliest leaders of the Soviet Union, people like Lenin and Trotsky had blood on their hands. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens were killed during the so-called Red Terror that accompanied the Russian Civil War. The purging of kulaks in the countryside, supposed kind of greedy landlords. This was also the same era where you saw the Cheka, the state security organization that would be rebranded a number of different times, but would ultimately be best known by the acronym the KGB, which would act against Soviet citizens or anybody who even appeared to be voicing any sort of opposition to the Bolshevik government. Particular turning points you could identify here would be the Red Army's invasion of Ukraine in 1919 against the opposition of the local government there, or the brutal crushing of a workers' and soldiers' uprising at Kronstadt in 1921, which, I mean, if you've got a party that claims to represent the working class of Russia, and you've got to use violence to suppress a general strike, like, you know you've lost the plot there. Honestly, though, I'm not sure what the options of the communist government were at this point. I mean, if you look at the factions that opposed them, the Russian monarchists in particular were just as ruthless. There were foreign boots on Russian soil. If the communists had not been as ruthless as they would have been overthrown. But the fact that they were as ruthless as they ended up being, trampling on freedom of expression, even of the political left in the Soviet Union, meant that the revolution ended up losing its soul from a pretty early date.
Don't make me kill you. Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy! If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
In subsequent decades, tens of millions of Soviet citizens would be interred in what Solzhenitsyn termed the Gulag Archipelago, a network of extrajudicial prison camps, as well as several million Soviet citizens who were executed for opposing the government, speaking out against the regime, or honestly, under Joseph Stalin, for not much of anything at all. Even the barest hint that an individual might be against Comrade Stalin was enough to get you shot. Also, after World War II, you saw the creation of a Soviet empire in East Central Europe, with the construction of communist dictatorships in the image of the Soviet Union. Recommended sources to check out on the 1917 revolution in Russia. If you want a very readable journalistic account, John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World from 1919 gives you the eyewitness account of an American leftist who was present for a lot of these events and who was something of a fan of what was going on. You could also check out the recent work of the novelist China Miéville, who is best known for his weird fiction, which is great and you should absolutely check out, but he is also something of a Marxist and has several advanced scholarly degrees. He published 1917, which is sort of a blow-by-blow of the events as they unfolded. For a more critical view of the Russian Revolution, perhaps the first place to go would be the work of the Polish communist Rosa Luxemburg, who is on my shirt because she is awesome. Her work, simply entitled The Russian Revolution, provides a left-wing critique of what was going on and stands as a testimony that if anybody should resent the abuses of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the name of communism, it should be those on the political left. And Luxemburg saw from the very beginning that there were certain grim compromises that were being made in the Soviet Union that were simply unacceptable from a human perspective. If you're looking for an actual historian who is profoundly critical of the Russian Revolution, probably the go-to work is Richard Pipes's The Russian Revolution from 1982. He is not a fan, but certainly he is a talented interpreter of a lot of these sources. If you want something a little bit more even-handed, the Australian historian Sheila Fitzpatrick, her work, also entitled The Russian Revolution from 1990, is a somewhat more generous interpretation, while still being willing to criticize some of these events. So for our verdict, some of where one stands on the Russian Revolution depends in large part on how sympathetic one is to the aims of the revolutionaries. I confess, in some ways, I have a great deal of sympathy for what they were trying to achieve, to come up with a society that was more just and more free, which ultimately makes the failures of the revolution that much more galling. In some ways, this was a betrayal of their ideals. And maybe one of the worst things is that this Russian Revolution, when all was said and done, ended up setting up a system in which the concept of truth itself was betrayed. The Soviet citizens knew that there were profound flaws in the system in which they lived, but at the same time, they were not free to express their views on that system or to openly criticize it. They had to pretend that things were great and that everything was working perfectly. And if I am going to dub this series No BS History, I certainly cannot endorse any sort of system that made its citizens live and breathe BS on a daily basis. That's all I got for you. As always, make sure to check your sources and evidence. See you.